I'm going to just open the meetup, and look, it's absolutely fantastic to see the response that we've got from this. It's really quite thrilling. I only started this meetup a couple of months ago, and we've already got like 115 members. Just a little bit about the run of the day. So we're having first a talk by Alex Defoe on just an overview of the subject of parapsychology, going through a few different things and the methodologies related to the scientific investigation of these kinds of phenomena. The fire drill is, if there's a fire, just get the hell out of here. The stairs are over there. And I'll hand you over to Alex Defoe. A little bit of an intro about Alex. Alex is a full-time researcher and lecturer at Monash University with a PhD in experimental psychology. So let's have it for Alex.
Hey everyone. Thanks for coming along today. So I was just going to thank Russ for his walk up. We're really glad to see the turnout today. Parapsychology is one of those topics that's a little bit niche. So it's really great to see so many people interested. A bunch of us usually go up to Sydney for the annual Australian Institute of Parapsychological Research Conference. And we maybe get 40 or 50 people, and that's kind of like a national conference. So the turnout here is really fantastic to see. So just make a start on the slides. And as Russ mentioned, essentially, I'd like to just give a broad overview of what parapsychology actually is, which I discovered is fairly hard to do in 30 minutes. So some parts I might be going through a little bit quickly, but I'll ask you to just hold your questions to the end to just try and make sure that I can cover all bases with the topics. And it is really a broad overview, so given the opportunity, I think we can possibly have presentations that go into more depth around specific topics down the track, like out-of-body states or psychokinesis, telepathy, and so forth. But they really require a bit of time to get into. So today will be more of like a surface level look at what parapsychology actually is, why study it and why take an interest in these topics. Now I was going to get everyone to do an activity, but the software is just not cooperating with me. You can have a go at this, and I was trying to make it all fancy so you can actually see the responses on the screen, which I don't think is going to happen today. But basically I'm curious to hear about what type of experiences everyone has had in terms of mystical or paranormal or psychical experiences. So you can have a go. I think I'll be able to see the responses on my phone, but unfortunately not on the screen. But there might be some discussion for that afterwards anyway, where we can kind of share what sort of experiences people have had. My own sort of interest in this topic arose from having my own experiences with out-of-body states. And this really drew me into the topic, especially I found I was looking for knowledge about what are out-of-body experiences. And there's so much I don't like using the word misinformation, but misjudged information about the topic, and a lot of esoteric texts, a lot of new agey texts around the topic. And I found there was a very little amount of actual scientific inquiry into this topic. And this is really what pushed me towards researching out-of-body states in more depth and going into graduate studies on this topic. And that really opened up looking at parapsychology more broadly, and why it's so fascinating to look at these different states of consciousness. So we can kind of start with the question of why look into parapsychology, or why study parapsychology in the first place. And like most things in psychology, I usually like to go back to William James, who was essentially the father of Western psychology, or psychology in the US, that then proliferated to what we knew as psychology at that time. And William James, with this approach of radical empiricism, was really interested in studying everything. Everything is part of the human experience, which is what made him such a fascinating human being. And of course, today's psychology is very narrow. It's a very specific discipline that will look at certain phenomena, but not others. But at the birth of the field, James was really interested in all mental states, all capacities. And I think this observation is quite telling and in some ways still relevant today. So James says, no part of the unclassed residuum has usually been treated with a more contemptuous scientific disregard than the mass phenomena generally called mystical. Physiology will have nothing to do with them, orthodox psychology turns its back on them, medicine sweeps them out, or at most, when in an anecdotal vein, records a few of them as effects of the imagination, which is a phrase of mere dismissal whose meaning is impossible to make precise. All the while, the phenomena are there, lying broadcast over the surface of history. No matter where you open its pages, you find things recorded under the name of divinations, inspirations, demonic possessions, apparitions, trances, ecstasies, miraculous healings, and productions of disease and occult powers possessed by peculiar individuals over persons and things in their neighbourhood. So there's a real acknowledgement that this phenomena can be seen throughout human history. We can go obviously a lot further back than the beginnings of psychology, into the Renaissance, or to further back to classical Greece, where a lot of these topics were talked about. Even in some of the debates, Plato and Aristotle, what is the nature of our reality, and trying to kind of understand some of these unexplained or difficult to explain phenomena that parapsychology is really interested in. Now, I might just introduce the term of, what actually is parapsychology. So we had a few people that turned up to the first event for this group that thought it was about something completely different, and I guess it is a confusing term because you have para and psychology. So we'll try and just break it down. If we look at the etymology, parapsychology really comes from Greek. So para meaning beside or beyond, so next to psychology. So I think the reason that they went with this term is because we can't really class all the phenomena within normative psychological methods. So we kind of look at them as almost outside of and next to psychology. That doesn't necessarily make these experiences less valid or less legitimate, as some people tend to presume with this phrasing. And in fact, it was adopted from German in 1930 by J.B. Ryan, rather than using paranormal or psychical studies. So before then, when people talked about these experiences, they would talk about mystical states or spiritual states or psychical experiences. But we see with the beginning of the Ryan Research Center in the US, this move towards a more scientific approach, away from language like psychical studies and towards parapsychology. So we kind of see this more scientific phrasing. Obviously, there's the exception of Britain, which still, for the most part, is stuck with psychical phenomena. They have the Society for Psychical Research over there. But in the US, in Australia, we tend to use the word parapsychology when referring to psychical effects. And of course, psychology itself, also from Greek, psyche being soul, and psychology being, the second part being the logical system of understanding the soul, essentially. You might be surprised that actually quite a high proportion of people have had mystical or paranormal experience. The thing is that they don't necessarily have them consistently or frequently, which is what I found in some of my research. It's not necessarily easy to capture that you can kind of get people into the laboratory that will demonstrate these effects very easily. However, if you ask people over a long course of developmental time, so over the past 10 years in their life, most people have actually had something weird or paranormal or unusual happen to them. And we do see instances of these. The thing is they're rare, but most people can kind of relate to them. And when you ask someone, they will remember and talk about the experience, but usually people might not think much of it, like it was just a weird visionary experience or a dream or some sort of distortion in perception. They kind of write it off. But if we look at them a bit more closely, a lot more frequent than we might think. But basically, part of the reason I had for this is to also ask everyone about the broad nature of experiences you might have had. Because in psychology, we tend to approach science from one of two perspectives, from the top down or from the bottom up. So looking at the ground and what's actually happening in reality. So for example, asking everyone here what sort of experiences you've had, collating them together as data and trying to understand similarities that come up. Or we can look at it from a top down. So I might come up with a theory of most people have this type of experience and try and see how many people match up to that experience. Now, there are pros and cons to using each approach. Rhea White, who came up with the term exceptional human experience, suggested that sometimes these experiences are stigmatized. So, if you tell someone about a parapsychological experience you've had, their reaction might be pretty varied, as I'll talk a bit about later as well. Rhea White thought that the term exceptional human experience is a more empowering way of looking at it, rather than this weird experience that you might have encountered. She used a very much bottom-up approach of asking people what type of experiences they've had, and essentially generated a list of a lot of different types of experiences that you can see here. You can maybe relate to some of these experiences you've had. And one of the benefits of this bottom-up approach is that it gives us this broad spectrum of experiences that people encounter. So it's very interesting, but one of the drawbacks is that it can be a bit too broad. So Rhea White's model has been accused of being a little bit imprecise, of just kind of collecting data about everything. And some of these I don't even know what they are. Like if I sat down with the person and talked to them, I'd probably understand what the experience was, but they're not typically categorized into strict topics or strict categories. So basically looking at everything in a spectrum of what human beings can encounter in terms of psychical experiences, and some of them are really out there. But that's one approach to research and to look at just what's actually occurring in the everyday population. And Rhea White's work is really good for that. An alternative approach published about 10 years ago in Germany by Wolfgang Fasch actually looked at this more top-down approach, and he suggested that we need a model to really classify parapsychological experiences a bit more succinctly, rather than just say, here are these 300-400 different types of experiences not classed in any particular way. So he suggested a 4-axis model, looking at internal experiences versus external experiences, dissociative experiences, and coincidences. Now, as many of you have probably encountered, no theory or no model is perfect. So this is one way to visualize parapsychological experiences. It's not necessarily the best way. It is a bit more structured and clear-cut than Rhea White's approach. So what would we kind of expect in each of these categories, for example? You can kind of guess anything that relates to the body-self split or dissociation from the body, alterations in body perception like out-of-body experiences, for instance. Could be invisible sensations. This is something like experiencing a sense of something on your arm, for instance, that's not actually there, for example. Automatic writing tends to be dissociative as well, so you start writing and not actually doing it consciously, but just seeing what comes through the unconscious mind. And obviously mediumship channeling would fit into that category as well, because there's a move away from the ego and channeling from another source, whether that's the unconscious mind or some other source of information that the person is accessing. Internal experiences would expect more clairvoyant type of phenomena, so visual imagery, also internal sensations like energy or different feelings that might come up. External coincidences, according to Fasch, would be more telepathic type of communication, deja vu, precognition, synchronicity, prophetic dreams, things like that. The reason they go into coincidences is because the way Fasch developed this model is essentially in dissociative, the reality function and the self function are in discord. In coincidences, the reality function and the self function are in concord. So when we experience something like synchronicity or deja vu or clairvoyance, it's almost as though our external reality and internal reality are in complete harmony and cohesion. Whereas dissociation, we see a split of some sort, whether that's body, mind, automatic writing or channeling, for instance. And finally, external, so something that's actually perceived outside of ourselves. So perception of apparitions, ghosts, psychokinetic experiences, moving an object in mind, invisible presences, poltergeist, those sort of things. Hearing things, acoustic phenomena, or clairaudience. temperature changes that are not accounted for physically, like not someone just turned off the heater or something, but there's a sensible drop straight away, would also fall under external. So this is another way of looking at it. I wanted to give everyone kind of a bit of contrast between just looking at the broad spectrum of experiences and trying to categorize them in a specific way, like this model. So one of the questions that really stifles even researchers in this area is what actually is psi? What are we actually talking about when we talk about manipulating this type of experience, whether internally or externally? What is it actually that we're discussing? And this is where a lot of the criticism in parapsychology comes up. Trying to actually capture psi, like actually what is it? Is it energy, or is it mental potential, or is it something else? So I'd like to give you guys also a few theories or a few ideas about what people think psi actually is. The first one suggests that there's actually not anything paranormal about psi, but that we've just yet to discover hidden aspects of our biology or human experience or physiology. The common one is Rupert Sheldrake, who trained as a biologist, who actually argues that psi could be like a sixth sense, but not a sixth sense in the extrasensory potential, but more so an actual sense that we might have lost evolutionarily. Like, if you see a cat staring into space, one explanation could be that they're using some sort of capacities, intuition, to see something that we can't see because we've just outgrown that capacity from an evolutionary perspective. Sheldrake has data that's pretty good to back this up. Data around psychic pets, so dogs that know when their owner is coming home, as well as this feeling of being stared at. So if you've ever kind of had the feeling that someone's staring at you in a room, and you turn around and they are actually staring at you, again, Sheldrake argues that maybe it's not paranormal or psychical, that we kind of sense that they're staring at us, but it's some sort of part of our brain that is actually a physical function. Could be to do with mirror neurons or who knows, but that picks up on that staring. So the first explanation of this is that there's nothing paranormal or parapsychological or anomalous about psi, but that it's actually an extension of physical capacity. The next explanation is that psi is actually more of a spiritual energy. So if we talk about metaphysics and spirituality, this one I won't go into much depth because you can pick up any spiritual book in a bookshop that will kind of offer this explanation that energy can be used to induce an out-of-body state or a psychic healing state or a telekinetic state. Doesn't necessarily still explain what it actually is, but this explanation that it is some sort of energy that we can manipulate non-physically. Another explanation, and the reason I've kind of put this in a different colours, because this is an explanation I find most compelling. Again, not necessarily the right one, but one explanation is that psi is a type of psychological energy. So if we look at this idea of the unconscious mind and the collective unconscious, introduced by psychiatrist Carl Jung, we can actually explain quite a lot of psi through this model. So for example, synchronicity or other types of psychic phenomena may actually relate to this accessing of the collective unconscious at a deeper level. And the writings of Carl Jung really cover this quite well, where he would be sitting with patients and discussing something literal, and then something symbolic would happen, like a book would fall off the bookshelf, or a butterfly would fly past the window. And these sort of synchronicities would come up where the internal and external would line up. So I think the psychological explanation can actually offer quite a lot, but is maybe under-researched to some extent. Another explanation, so psi is more of a quantum energy. This comes from more of the physics perspective. So Dean Radin's laboratory at the Institute of Noetic Sciences suggests that it's more to do with quantum physics and quantum effects rather than Newtonian physics. And this is again one of the big criticisms of, how can we provide evidence for telepathic communication or empathy or these sort of phenomena within Newtonian physics? And the answer is we can't. So it's a big problem. But Dean Radin suggests that a new physics may actually explain some of these psi phenomena. So another explanation there. And finally, a recent one by Jim Carpenter, who suggests that psi is actually embedded in everyday experience. There's nothing out of the ordinary about it. It's just that we're looking at it from the wrong perspective. If we start to view it as part of everyday life, it's not actually outside of psychology or outside of experience. It's just embedded in everyday social and psychological processes. So another alternative model there. I personally take more of a developmental perspective in looking at what actually interlinks all of these phenomena, rather than just saying, let's study out-of-body states or let's study lucid dreams. I find it really interesting to look at the overall overlap between these abilities or psi reports and how they tend to be linked to some level or some sort of spiritual development that someone has attained. And this, of course, is consistent with some of the Eastern traditions of various gurus or masters sitting in meditation for decades and really practicing in a lot of depth and achieving these fantastical capacities. So this is kind of my own personal perspective, that I think they're all kind of interlinked by level of development, and it's also evidenced empirically somewhat, because when we get people into the laboratory, again, they rarely can actually demonstrate these effects consistently. But when we find, like for example, I did a study with one of my friends living in Perth on out-of-body experiences, and we found that if we actually recruit people who are experts at inducing out-of-body experiences, we get much stronger hit rates than just taking a random sample. So again, I think there's good empirical support that there is a level of development where you're developing psychical or spiritual capacity. You suddenly might have more lucid dreaming or out-of-body states, but then you may find you have other psi experiences as well. So I think they're not as discrete and disconnected as we might think. I think there's like a real overlay there. But one of the things we can consider is, why are people skeptical about psi phenomena? Is there a legitimate reason for skepticism, or are some of the skeptical approaches actually warranted? And if you look back to that list by Rhea White, you can probably certainly pick and pull certain experiences out of there that maybe you're a bit suspicious about whether people are actually having these sort of experiences. So skepticism definitely is warranted in some instances. I basically designed this Venn diagram because we're in discussion around what is actually parapsychology and how does it differ from other fields of consciousness. My own background is more so in consciousness studies, but I kind of have an interest in parapsychology as well. And you'll find certain people are more inclined to look at the spiritual nature of experiences. So they're not so much interested in looking at proof, they're more interested in discussing with people what types of experiences they've had. But then you also have more skeptical type of investigators. They usually call themselves anomalistic psychologists. Back when Monash Uni had a unit on parapsychology, I kept asking, so I was asked to be involved with that unit, and I kept asking my supervisor why he's just shooting down every type of phenomenon. So every week they would introduce one phenomenon and then explain why people are just hallucinating it or why it's not real. And this is generally more the anomalistic perspective. So I kind of color-coded it. Green is more open-minded. You probably don't want to be too open-minded that you just kind of accept everything. Red is more really, really strict with not accepting any evidence unless it's very stringent and replicable and provides really clear-cut explanation. So generally on this side, we kind of see, starting off, researchers generally won't believe that something paranormal has happened. They might interview the person, get them to try and replicate it, and then look for other explanations. Are there hallucinations that they might be prone to as part of a psychological diagnosis, for instance? Or, could there be, other explanations like they misperceived it? So they'll try and rule out all of those explanations first. Here, we generally see in the transpersonal spiritual psychology, these people will just accept anything as valid, as part of people's experience. So if we look at this kind of open-minded, skeptical spectrum, I think sometimes it's good to kind of be more in the middle, but these are different fields of study and offer different ways of looking at the phenomena. So if you study a degree in transpersonal psychology, very broad accounts of people's experiences, studying parapsychology, purely looking at psychical phenomena and research methods around this. Consciousness is more interested in why we have consciousness studies, I should say, actually. Why we actually have phenomenal consciousness, why the mind can't just function without consciousness. And anomalistic, looking at, why are all of these people reporting all these weird experiences, how can we explain them without invoking paranormal events? But they also overlap, which I think is really fascinating when we look at the periphery or the overlay between these fields. So parapsychologists and consciousness researchers are are interested in looking at how does psi relate to the mind, what can it tell us about different mind states. In terms of the parapsychology spiritual development overlap, I think is also really fascinating, as I mentioned earlier. So trying to get people to do some sort of training of maybe self-inducing out-of-body experiences before going into the lab. Obviously, both consciousness studies and anomalistic studies look at anything deviant from the consciousness spectrum, so any unusual experiences. And finally, if we look at the overlay between spiritual development, consciousness studies, and parapsychology, there's a lot of stuff in esoteric religious studies literature as well that informs some of our understanding of these transcendent states. There's been a lot published around energetic healing, so approaches like Reiki or pranic healing have really gotten into good journals to show that actually placing your hands on someone through a healing approach causes positive change. A lot of them are pre-post or correlational studies, but some of the most impressive evidence I found is actually in the quantum touch literature, where they film a person doing the healing and actually see, like for example, someone with scoliosis, within 20 minutes, the vertebrae will actually shift in front of the camera and you can watch the healing take place. I think it's pretty good evidence. Zener card studies also tend to have really good effects. Again, especially if you get someone who's quite good at this particular technique, the general idea is holding up a card. You tell me which card I'm holding up. Asking a random person, they might get it right or wrong just around chance, but some people seem to be able to demonstrate very strong replicable effects, indicating level of clairvoyance. And finally, the strongest sort of evidence is actually around psychokinesis and random number generators. So seeing if participants can actually predict or manipulate the results. This started out with early dice studies. And of course, if I throw a dice, 1 in 6 chance that I'm going to get it right anyway, predicting where the dice falls. So they later kind of graduated towards random number generator studies, which, it's more difficult to guess or just get a chance answer. And meta-analyses on this topic really show quite strong evidence. So we'll just look at the last few perhaps. So Nelson, 2017, thousands of studies, 10 to the power of 12 to 1 chance. So again, pretty fantastic evidence there for psychokinesis. Study from 2017 looked at 13 studies. Again, they found 10 to the power of 13 to 1. And recently, Dean Radin's review of double slit experiments, so 17 studies, 10 to the power of 12 to 1 beyond chance. So probably this is the strongest evidence we currently have for psi, and I think if this doesn't convince someone, nothing will, essentially, because the statistical effects are just insane. So I'll just kind of very briefly run down on practical psi approaches, because this is really where my interest lies. I think Dean Radin captures this really well by saying magic didn't miraculously disappear with the rise of the scientific worldview. Magic is still intensely present. Prayer is a form of intentional magic, a mental act intended to affect the world in some way. Wearing a sacred symbol is a form of sympathetic magic, a symbolic correspondence said to transcend space and time. Many religious rituals are forms of ancient ceremonial magic. The abundance of popular books on the power of affirmations and positive thinking are all based on age-old magical principles. So I find that this particular approach really of looking at it from the perspective of magic or of capacity for human development is really interesting, that this is something that surrounds our entire scope of experience. So in terms of working with altered states, and again, very briefly, I'll go into this, powerful techniques that can induce an altered state are breath work. So things like holotropic breath work developed by Stanislav Grof, for instance. Concentration techniques, we find a lot of these drawn out from Buddhist type practices on cultivating altered states, and even in other traditions like Hinduism of what are called siddhis or capacities of mind. And of course meditation, so learning to really understand how our minds work. I'll give you guys some handouts in a moment, but basically a really broad overview of brainwave states. So actually understanding that we can move from a more awake state into a theta brainwave state where we're kind of just on the precipice of sleep but not quite in sleep. We can work with some of these capacities as well. There are things like clinical hypnosis, which show good evidence of entering a trance state. The recent study I did on out-of-body experience actually combined hypnotherapy, trying to get people into a trance state and loosen some of their perceptions first. There are things like visualization, especially when talking about telepathy and clairvoyance. So what do you actually see in your mind's eye? But of course, before doing that, trying to clear the mental set or the mental space. Obviously, card type of exercises, Zener cards and so forth. Mediumship channeling and dream work type of experiences. So trying to actually cultivate prophetic dreams or visionary experiences. I've also put up a bit of an activity here, just maybe to ponder, and some of you might like to revisit after the session, but most of us generally experience around 50,000 thoughts a day, so our minds are really quite busy, and if we can quieten the mind, as many parapsychologists do with using meditation or trance or the Gansfeld, kind of like flotation type procedures of blocking out the senses, we can actually get much higher quality results. I don't think we've got the time to do this, but basically an activity you can have a look at later to try and get into this state of going beyond your ego and beyond being stuck with your thoughts. All right, so I'll also hand out some additional material. I've got a one-page handout which just gives a really good summary of parapsychology, and then a 10-page longer handout, so feel free to take both, or if you're not that interested in the topic, you might like to just take the shorter one. Think about whether you're really keen on reading into it or not. If you're really interested in it, have a look at some of these resources as well. If you go to my website, you can access an even longer resource, around 20 or 30 pages, which really outlines parapsychology and some of these topics. I recently started a research institute with Dr. Kylie Harris, who's one of the leading researchers on psychosis and spiritual emergency, so you can check that out on the accs.org.au. There's not much there at the moment, but have a look at what we're planning to do. And finally, in the United States, last year, we saw the launch of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, which in my view is really at the cutting edge of a lot of parapsychology research. So for those of you that are more research-minded, definitely have a look at the eprc.org. If you're kind of more practical-minded, take a look at my website where I take a more practical approach to parapsychology. Any questions or comments or thoughts? Yes?
My name is Maya. Just very briefly, what did you call the card activity? Does it have a name?
The Zener cards. So they're basically called Zener cards, and they have different symbols on them, like a wave or a circle or a square. Participants are usually familiar with the 5 variations, but they don't know which one it is that's been held up. So the experimenter might hold up a card and say, which card am I holding up? And it might be a wave. So if they say wave, they get it right. But remember, there's 5 choices, so it's a 1 in 5 chance of getting it right anyway. But after maybe 20 or 30 trials, if they've got 90% of them right, that suggests that there's something going on there.
Sure. And how do you spell Zener?
Zener.
Thank you.
Why do we need to study parapsychology?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think I thought of this, when designing the presentation, and this is really why I put the William James. Actually, you might have walked. I don't know if you walked in late. You might have missed the William James quote, but I actually asked the question of why study parapsychology. My answer to that is the William James quote, which basically suggests no part of the human experience should be left unstudied. And unfortunately, psychology has become more and more narrow, especially over the last few decades, where we look at very specific experiences as being scientifically credible, and others as just being completely ignored. This is the reason I think there's like a whole, universe internally we can explore, and a whole cartography of different states that people are just not aware of every day. Because, if you look at research such as that of Ian McGilchrist, looking at the left and right brain hemisphere and polarization of different capacities, we do live in a very left brain verbal society. It's just kind of how it's structured. But you're totally right that the right brain is actually, like in McGilchrist's book titled The Master and the Emissary, it's not the left brain we think the left brain is the master, the right brain is the emissary, but it's actually the right brain that's the master and the left brain that's the emissary. So I think some of these experiences also, as you can read about in the worksheets I'll hand out, they kind of break open people's experience. So they've got this very fixed worldview, and suddenly they've had this experience that's completely challenged that and kind of broken it apart, and then they have to reintegrate. So that's kind of maybe another reason that it's worth looking into these topics. A really great question.
Just because, I've spent some time in temples, and I feel like when I've been doing long meditations, my, like what you call psychic abilities is strengthened. And I feel like even though technology does help in a way, it also hinders us because we become more scattered with our thinking. We're not as centered because we're constantly distracted by notifications and what we're doing tomorrow and what we're doing yesterday. And so our minds get so busy that it weakens our ability to have that psychic ability. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on this.
How psychic abilities, and this is kind of where there's a bit of debate, are we naturally open to psychic abilities and then they kind of get shut down developmentally later in life? And that's one explanation there for the question around, that's being too logical and too kind of embedded in the world actually shut us down from psychic abilities. And then when we go to, say, an ashram or a temple, we suddenly experience a lot of them. I think that's kind of one explanation, and it links really well to that question as well around left and right brain capacity, because when you get into that symbolic meditative state, it's a different state of consciousness. And a lot of the experiments, they don't seem to work very well because, you've got people hooked up to EEG and these different devices and then telling them to try and practice telepathic communication, and they're just so stressed out that they're just thinking a million things, it's not working. But if you can get someone to really quieten their mind, and a lot of the time, this is why psych phenomena happen spontaneously with friends, or say you're thinking of someone and suddenly the phone calls, because you're probably quite relaxed, you're not in this hyper-stressed state. Whereas if you're attending a controlled experiment, you're maybe not as relaxed. So I think that's a really big topic. Again, in the handouts, I've taught quite a lot into developmental psychology and personality. So my perspective is yes, that personality can become a bit too focused on the logical and not on the abstract, but also the way that parents raise children and, is this hocus pocus or is this something worth exploring, can make a big developmental impact, and how they prioritise that as well. Yes.
Look, I'm not being just showing off here. That's my profession, in a sense. The right brain or the intuitive part can be blocked by so many different factors. Gut-brain axis, minerals, toxins. The biggest is trance, childhood trance, that's trapped into the mind, which makes it race with no escape. So tons and tons of programming. You go to school where you come to this life where you get the programming software.
Yes, thanks for sharing that. I think there's definitely a lot there as well, and for those that are interested in this topic, I can send around more resources specifically around that. I'll just finish up with this in terms of structure of the brain. Of course, this whole hypothesis that why did our brains exponentially expand at a certain point in history, and the obvious kind of go-to explanation is that we started eating meat, whereas there are other explanations as well. You mentioned toxins and various other things, and how the left and right brain actually develop. Just quickly, if you look at the research of Tony Wright's Return to the Brain of Eden, it talks about how the two hemispheres develop through the bicameral mind and up to modern civilization, and also whether that's actually the normal way that we're supposed to perceive reality or not. So it's quite interesting to look at. Thanks, I'll finish.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Alex.